Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Hamas named the 6 Israeli hostages set for release in the final handover of the ceasefire's first phase, with negotiations for phase 2 due to start in the coming days. The family of Shiri Bibas say they cannot mourn her until her body is returned after Hamas released the remains of an unidentified woman at yesterday's handover. Mike Waltz tells CPAC Zelensky will sign the rare earth deal with the US in exchange for military support. And Germany heads to the polls this weekend as Friedrich Merz emerges as a favourite to take over as the Chancellor. To our top story, and Hamas have named the 6 Israeli hostages to be released this weekend. Eliya Cohen, Omer Shem Tov, Tal Shoham, Omer Wenkert, Hisham al-Sayed and Avera Mengisto will be handed back on Saturday, with Israel expected to free 600 Palestinian prisoners as part of the continuing ceasefire agreement. This release is the final one in this phase of the Gaza truce deal. Meanwhile, Hamas have admitted the remains of the dead Israeli hostage Shiri Bibas were mixed up with other human remains. A coffin believed to contain Shiri's body was handed over to the group yesterday. Israel later revealed they received the remains of an anonymous body without identification. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has warned Hamas they will pay, and Israeli forces have accused them of a serious violation of the ceasefire agreement. We can now speak to the author and Middle East correspondent Jotam Confino in Herzliya. Jotam, thank you so much for joining me. 2 of these hostages are civilians who have been held in Gaza for over a decade. Tell us about them and the others who are part of this final handover of the very first phase.
Yes, so Hisham al-Sayed and Avera Mengisto have both spent over a decade in Gaza. Both of them crossed the border into Gaza. Avera Mengisto did it without knowing. I think he went into Gaza, at least that's the assumption. He's also been suffering from mental illness. He has an Ethiopian background, and his family only really saw proof of life 2 years ago. So for many years, they didn't know if he was even alive. And as for Hisham al-Sayed, he also is dealing with mental illnesses such as schizophrenia. And Hamas falsely claimed that he was a soldier that crossed into Gaza, but he is not a soldier. He is a civilian. And his family also only received proof of life 3 years ago. So they're now slated to come out along with 4 other civilian male hostages tomorrow.
Hamas have said the remains of the dead Israeli hostage Shiri Bibas were mixed up with other human remains. The group claims Shiri and her children were killed in an Israeli airstrike. However, Israeli forces have disputed this. We've now heard from the Bibas family. What have they had to say?
So the Bibas family is, of course, devastated. Not only did they get Ariel, 9 months old, and Kvir, 9 months old, and Ariel, 4 years old, out in body bags. They learned today that after forensic examination, that the terrorists who held them had killed them with their bare hands. That's the Israeli examination. But they also found out that Shiri was not among the hostages who were released. And they don't know why, simply. The only explanation they've gotten from Hamas is that they mixed up the bodies. I don't think anyone in Israel really buys that explanation, because the Bibas family had become a symbol of the hostages, that the whole world really knew who they are. So they were obviously kept in dangerous places inside Gaza. But I believe that the terror groups that held Shiri, they also knew what a price they could extract from her. So Israel is now demanding through the mediators that Hamas release her body immediately.
When are we expecting the second phase of negotiations to start, Jotam? And could this really be more difficult now we've just spoken about the Bibas family and the effect that this could possibly have on a already really fragile agreement?
So as for the second phase and the negotiations, they should have actually started more than 2 weeks ago. But because of all of the chaos and turmoil that happened between Israel and Hamas in the past couple of weeks, these negotiations haven't taken place. But yesterday, Donald Trump, the U.S. president, his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, was reportedly set to meet with an Israeli minister to start these discussions about implementing the second phase of the ceasefire. And Steve Witkoff apparently also spoke to Qatar, which is mediating all of this. So behind closed doors, I believe that the negotiations have slowly begun. But there's a lot at stake here. And as you mentioned, the fate of the Bibas family could derail everything. After tomorrow, when the 6 alive hostages have been released, there are many people in Israel who believe that Israel will go back to fighting Hamas because they don't have an incentive to continue this ceasefire with a group that constantly violates the deal and also desecrates and humiliates the hostages.
Jotam Confino, author and Middle East correspondent, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. The British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, will meet President Trump at the White House next Thursday. French President Emmanuel Macron will visit on a Monday. Both leaders are set to discuss security guarantees for Ukraine with the US President. A woman who claimed to be the missing Madeleine McCann has been charged with stalking. 23-year-old Julie Wandelt was arrested in England and remanded in custody. McCann's disappearance is one of the world's most puzzling missing child cases after vanishing during a family holiday in Portugal in 2007. Only 1 in 6 Japanese citizens holds a passport, according to some new data. The weakness of Japan's currency, the yen, and rising inflation are among the factors deterring outbound travellers. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, about a quarter of Japanese people held valid passports. The latest dip comes as the country welcomes a record number of tourists from other countries. And a picture of a humpback whale along with its calf has helped Alvaro Herrero earn the title of Underwater Photographer of the Year. The Spaniard was up against 6,750 other entries to claim this year's prize. The competition, which started back in 1965, awards photography beneath the surface of the oceans, lakes, rivers, and even swimming pools, attracting entries from around the world. Now, the Conservative Political Action Conference, also known as CPAC, is currently taking place in Maryland. Earlier today, U.S. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz told the conference he expected President Zelensky to sign the rare minerals deal with the U.S. in exchange for military support. It comes days after a war of words between both Trump and Zelensky, with the U.S. president calling the Ukrainian leader a dictator for refusing to hold elections. We can now go live to Washington to speak to our foreign correspondent, Sara Firth. Thank you so much for joining me. So despite the back and forth of name calling this week, the minerals deal looks to actually be back on. How much is it worth and what is the US offering in exchange?
Yes, you've got the National Security Advisor speaking today at CPAC, that annual Republican gathering, saying President Zelensky will sign that deal. Now, that deal he's referring to is the deal to give the U.S. access to rare mineral deposits in Ukraine. Now, the U.S. sees this deal as one way to claim back, get compensation for some of the money, both financial support and military support that they've provided Ukraine since the start of the war. But also they say this will be a good economic partnership and provide more security guarantees, if anything, for Ukraine. But what we saw at the start of the week is Ukrainian President Zelensky rejecting that initial agreement. Although it is important to note, he didn't rule out any agreement whatsoever. But as you said, that sparked this pretty explosive war of words. It played a fairly major part in what the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, speaking at the White House on Thursday at a press conference, he told us that President Trump was frustrated with Zelensky over this mineral deal and this war of words that has erupted. The president saying Zelensky's a dictator without elections. Quite remarkable words coming from a sitting US president. And I think what we've seen from the National Security Advisor today, and what we've also seen from an interview with the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is they're trying to take some of the heat out of this very explosive war of words that's occurred between Ukraine and the United States.
Let's talk about Marco Rubio. He said a possible meeting between Trump and Putin will depend on whether any progress is made on ending the war in Ukraine. What else did the Secretary of State have to say? And any update on that meeting between Trump and Putin?
That's what everyone is watching for. He did reveal some new details about the meeting that had been held with Sergei Lavrov, with the Russian foreign minister. He said, look, no details were actually discussed when it comes to talking about possible concessions that Ukraine might have to make when it comes to territory. He said the purpose of this initial meeting was to find out if Russia is interested in talking about an end to the war, is willing to move forward for a peace agreement. When he was asked whether Russia was, he said that he doesn't know right now, that actions here are speaking louder than words. He said action is not a noun, it's a verb. Peace is not a noun, it's a verb. It requires action. So what he's saying is, look, if after this initial meeting that's been had between the foreign ministers, you have Russia coming to the table and asking for things that are maximalist and unrealistic, well, that will speak for itself. Now, that is very interesting context, given the fact that the Ukrainian President Zelensky's clear discomfort with the fact that Ukraine was not at the table. And again, this war of words that has erupted, you can see the Secretary of State was saying, look, all options are still on the table. It's going to need, he said, all sides to participate in any kind of peace agreement if and when that happens. And I think really important to note, you know, here in Washington, you've had so much uproar about what's been happening with this war of words. When you talk to these diplomats and in diplomatic circles here, there's a lot of confusion about what President Trump was trying to do with these comments over Ukraine and President Zelensky. Is there a strategy behind it? Was he just shooting from the hip? The Secretary of State saying, look, that he was very upset with Zelensky, and rightfully so. He described President Trump as someone who's not going to sit back and take what he described as the U.S. being hustled. So again, very strong language, but I really think it's important to note, you know, some of those claims that President Trump has made over the past few days, that Ukraine started the war, for example. You know, I was on the ground actually in Ukraine when that invasion started. It barely needs saying, but here we are having to state it, that it was Russia that started the war. It was Russia that invaded. And it is interesting that, you know, you've got this very heated rhetoric happening here in the corridors of power in the White House behind me. But these are diplomats that haven't necessarily seen war. And these words from President Trump, they have a real life impact potentially on those Ukrainian soldiers fighting on the front line. You can only imagine what they'll be thinking, watching what's been playing out this week. But now, today, you've got the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz. You've had the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, just trying to reduce some of that tension and get the focus back on the move towards some kind of peace agreement.
Sara, Firth, foreign correspondent in Washington, thank you so much for joining me. Now, Germany will go to the polls this weekend following a collapse of a coalition government led by current Chancellor Olaf Scholz. The main opposition party, the Christian Democratic Union, led by Conservative leader Friedrich Merz, is the current favourite, alongside its sister party, the Christian Social Union. The right-wing ADF party has claimed the next spot, according to the latest polls. The state of the economy, migration and Russia's war in Ukraine are among the top issues for voters in this parliamentary election. Let's hear more now from our correspondent, Trent Murray, who's in Berlin. Trent, thank you for joining me. This election in Germany is happening in bitter, cold winter for the first time in decades. Is this significant at all?
Well, Leigh Ann, I think it tells you exactly just how we got here. This election was not meant to be held right now. It was originally slated for the kind of European spring, summer period. It would have made it much nicer, one would imagine, for all of those candidates out door knocking and trying to canvass on the streets. But the reason we're having it now in the depths of the European winter is because Olaf Scholz's former government collapsed after a fairly spectacular divorce with some of those parties that were part of it. And so right now we've been thrust into this early election. Nevertheless, they're trying to not let the weather affect the campaign trail. You certainly still see many party volunteers out on the street trying to bolster their base. But it certainly is, I think, a signal of the fact that this is an early election. It was not intended to take place right now, but those leading candidates for Chancellor are hoping that there might be brighter days ahead, I guess you could say, for them and their parties as they conduct that race for the Chancellery with less than 48 hours to go until polls open.
Yes, indeed. And I was mentioning there in the intro that the CDU is still expected to win. But this might surprise some people, as I feel like the AfD party has been dominating the political agenda in Germany. Why have we seen a rise of the far right there?
Well, look, I think in many ways what Alice Weidel, the leader of the AfD, is doing is trying to tap into some of the discontent that exists, certainly within large swathes of the voting population here. She's really zeroed in on some pretty significant issues, including cracking down on illegal immigration, on rallying against so-called green energy mandates, which she says are strangling Germany's economy, as well as law and order. They are very similar themes to the ones we hear so often now in elections in the West, particularly in Western Europe, and of course with President Trump being elected now in the US. That is clearly working because she is now sitting second in the polls with the AfD. The CDU is still in front at 30% roughly. That's kind of the legacy Conservative party in this country, the party of former Chancellor Angela Merkel. Where the difficulty will be, though, for the AfD, despite doing very well in the polls right now and being second place, the other parties have a so-called firewall agreement between them. That effectively means they will lock the AfD out from any future negotiations to enter government. They say they're doing that because they think they are right-wing, they think they're extremists. So even if the AfD does very well on Sunday and places a strong second, it's still highly unlikely we will see them enter government. But what it will do is certainly cement Alice Weidel and the party into being a very strong contender as leader of the opposition for next time.
Trent, Germany is Europe's biggest economy. Now, Europe appears to be in this really sticky spot at the moment when it comes to America's comments on Ukraine and also defence spending. How important is this election result for stability across Europe as a whole?
Well, look, I think you can get a sense from it just based on how other European countries are looking at this election. There's a lot of media coverage of it in places like France and Belgium and Italy, because what happens in Germany really has a huge impact on the rest of the EU. As you said, it's the EU's biggest economy. It's the world's third largest economy after China and the United States. And so what happens on Sunday will have a ripple-on effect, not just across Europe and around the world. And you are right. I mean, Europe right now is having some very deep conversations around its sort of role in the world. We've seen President Trump sort of roar back onto the world stage, full of criticism of the EU over issues like trade imbalances and their support for Ukraine. And so right now, in many ways, I think the EU is looking for leadership to try and navigate these sort of turbulent, uncertain waters ahead that are here. And Germany really has to play a crucial role in that, which is why after this election takes place on Sunday, the Chancellor will have a lot of work to do, not just putting into place the campaign promises domestically, but also getting back to that negotiating table in Brussels to try and steer Europe through these quite troubling times.
Yes, indeed. Trent Murray in Berlin, looking very smart in your suit. Thank you very much. A remarkable discovery has been made in Egypt this week. A team of Egyptologists have found the first tomb of the pharaoh since Tutankhamun's was uncovered over a century ago. They located King Thutmose II's tomb near the city of Luxor. I'm now joined by the director of the Egypt Exploration Society and president of the International Association of Egyptologists. That's Dr. Chris Naunton. Chris, thank you so much for joining me this evening. So King Thutmose, nice to have you. King Thutmose II's tomb was the last undiscovered royal tomb of the 18th Egyptian dynasty. Why is this such an extraordinary and significant discovery?
Well, I mean, having a kind of new tomb, as it were, of any pharaoh is always going to be exciting. You know, Pharaoh was among the most powerful and wealthy men anywhere in the planet in their day. And these tombs, we know, in cases where they've been well preserved, are often stuffed full of, you know, the finest objects that human beings had created at that time. Thutmose II ruled at a particularly rich and powerful period for the Egyptians, and we know already of the whereabouts of the tombs of almost all the kings who come before and after him. So his was a kind of conspicuous gap in the evidence, and it's been filled.
Actually, there's one question I wanted to ask you, and you just touched on it there. The tomb was completely empty. You know, obviously, we've seen these amazing artifacts in a lot of the other tombs. Why was this?
Well, in fact, they are almost always found more or less empty. We know that these tombs, which were stuffed full of extremely valuable things, were very often robbed. And where we have the evidence for it, we can see that this often happened a very short space of time after the kings even were buried. So even in the case of the tomb of Tutankhamun, we know that was robbed at least twice within a matter of months of the king being buried there. And in most cases, those tombs are comprehensively ransacked. It's actually just the one or two very celebrated examples, like the tomb of Tutankhamun, which was found substantially intact, that have kind of clouded our judgment. You know, it makes us feel as though that's how it should be, when most of them, in fact, are found in this condition, empty, more or less.
The team weren't expecting to find it where they actually found it. Can you tell us more about the location of the discovery and why it really did take them by surprise?
Yeah, well, the reason is that this is a period of a few centuries, about 5 centuries, during which time the kings were buried in the very famous cemetery, the Valley of the Kings. So, you know, we might have expected to find this missing tomb, as it were, in the valley. And in actual fact, it's some 2.5 kilometers away further into the desert. And the Valley of the Kings is already, you know, in a quite remote location, a long way away from the Nile Valley where people were living, up in the high desert. This is even further, even more remote. And up until this point, we were not aware that there was really very much out there at all. We knew of a few tombs of some members of the royal family in some cases, but of no kings. So there was no sense up until this point that the tomb of a king ought to be there, and yet, you know, here it is suddenly. This is part of the sensation of what's been found.
Yes, absolutely amazing. The joint British and Egyptian team have been working together for 12 years, excavating 54 tombs during that time. Why is it so important teams like this continue to make these potentially groundbreaking discoveries that we're still seeing today, as we've just been talking about?
Well, I think to some extent there's just the sheer joy of new material, and the idea that the apparently barren desert can conceal these incredible things. But they're a window on the ancient past, and I'm not sure I have a very good explanation for it. But we, people like me who are interested in these things, are really, really intrigued to know more about what it was like in the past. It's as though there's a kind of veil that is lifted to some extent. In this case, on the life and death and burial of this king, an incredibly important figure, when we find material like this. And this is undoubtedly going to help us to understand what it was like for the king, what it was like for the Egyptian people all those thousands of years ago. And that's exciting. And with the more discoveries we have like this, and the more we can share the news of these discoveries, the more I think people are going to get hooked in and interested in the ancient past.
Egyptologist Dr. Chris Naunton, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at the top business news. Gold prices edged lower on Friday but remain on track for an 8th weekly gain. The rally is supported by safe haven demand on concerns over US President Donald Trump's tariff threats. Prices have shattered 2 record highs this week to trade above $2,950 a troy ounce, with Goldman Sachs seeing gold rising above $3,000 by the end of this year. Now, there's been a surprise boost for UK retail as food sales see the biggest jump since the start of the pandemic. Shops were given a big boost in January as retail sales rose as much as 1.7%, much more than the 0.3% rise forecast by economists. Growing retail sales can mean economic growth, which the government has repeatedly said is one of its top priorities. Let's turn to sports news now, and Premier League leaders will play Paris Saint-Germain, Arsenal will face PSV Eindhoven, and Aston Villa take on Club Brugge in Champions League Final 16. Real Madrid, who knocked out Man City in the knockout phase, will face local rivals Atletico Madrid, whilst Bayern Munich are up against Bayer Leverkusen. The 2-legged last 16 ties will be played on the 4th and 5th of March and the 11th and also the 12th of March. Now, PGA Tour is holding constructive talks with Donald Trump and also Live Golf. Conversations have been ongoing since the PGA Tour and DP World Tour agreed a shock merger with Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, which funds Live Golf. And those talks of a merger were announced in June. Live Golf Chairman Yasser Al-Ruhanem, US President Donald Trump, PGA Tour Commissioner Jay Monahan, and Player Director Adam Scott, as well as Tiger Woods, all met at the White House yesterday. Now, the Neom project in Saudi Arabia is one of the world's most revolutionary urban developments. And this week, Al Arabiya News was given exclusive access to the site. Phase 1 is due for completion by 2034. The line will allow visitors to experience the most beautiful marina in the heart of the Red Sea. The area will feature 80,000 residential units and 9,000 hotel rooms, as well as a brand new stadium to host matches during the 2034 FIFA World Cup in Saudi Arabia. I'm now pleased to say that I'm joined in the studio by Al Arabiya English journalist Jennifer Bell, who's been given that exclusive access to look at the site, and she got the chance to meet people behind it. Hi, Jennifer. Thank you for joining me this evening. Jennifer, pretty amazing access, and you've seen the progress firsthand. What's happening at the flagship line project?
Well, it's been a hive of activity. There's about a 10,000 strong workforce there just at the line itself, and ground has been broken. Excavation has started, and what we can see there is a start of what's going to be phase 1 of the 170-kilometre line. So phase 1 is going to be 2.4 kilometres, yes, we're going to see that phase come into fruition by about 2034. It will have, as we just heard, residential units, hotels, and what they say were the world's biggest football stadium. So it will open just in time for the FIFA World Cup in Saudi Arabia in 2034.
Absolutely amazing project, as we said, but extremely, extremely ambitious.
Yes.
It's going to be massive, like almost the size of New York or bigger. But tell me, you spoke to the senior Neom officials about this. What are they saying about the construction timeline?
Well, I think, first of all, they would like to kind of hit back at some scepticism. I mean, I think there has been some rumours about when it's going to be done, if it's been scaled back, and we spoke to 2 senior executives, and they have both dismissed that scepticism. They said this project was always one that was going to be delivered in phases. Phase 1 is very much on track. But like you said, I mean, 2.4 kilometres doesn't sound that big, but putting that into perspective, that's like, it's going to be the size of 2 football pitches side by side, and it's going to be half a kilometre tall. So it'd be like building 40 of the Burj Khalifa's, the world's tallest skyscrapers, in that 2.4 kilometre block. So you can't do that overnight. So very much on track, and it will be delivered when it will be delivered, basically.
Yeah, of course, in time for that World Cup, like you said. As we understand, the entire Neom mega project is being developed on only a fraction of the total space. So what's happening with the rest of the land surrounding it?
Of course. So when I went there, I was astonished at the size of it. I mean, it's 26,500 square kilometres, but they're only developing 5% of that. 95% of it is going to be reserved for nature, rewilding, regreening, and we saw the start of that. I mean, we saw some of this wildlife being reintroduced into the area that hasn't been seen in decades, from, you know, gazelles to oryxes to ostriches, and then by the end of the year, they want to reintroduce cheetahs. They've also planted more than kind of 4 million trees as part of the rewilding project, and a lot of the work has been done to preserve historical sites. We got a glimpse at a site in Badger where they're preserving this rock called Shiprock, and they've uncovered inscriptions dating back to the prehistoric times. So I think preserving this rich history has been key to the project.
Yes, indeed. And a project of this scale would require thousands of labourers and other staff, and a large amount of resources, of course. How is Neom managing to attract and provide for this workforce that's needed?
Well, I mean, they already have attracted. I mean, there's a 100-strong workforce across Neom. Like I said, 10,000 of those at the line. And I guess there's so many benefits. I mean, I've got access to one of the communities there called NC1, and it's just like any other modern city. You've got, you know, malls and cinemas and football pitches and basketball courts and everything a resident could want. I mean, we actually talked to one of the residents down there. She had an interesting story. She was the first Neom employee to have a baby in this community. And she said, a good thing, I can't think of anywhere safer in the world to bring up a family, or somewhere that's more community orientated. So I think, you know, these communities are serving their needs.
Yeah, life is being born, if you want to say it in 2 different ways. But we also just had a quick chat about dolphins and marine life, because that's something that I'd be really interested in. They also are making a big push for that. Yeah,
I mean, I think the key word for Neom is sustainability. And so everything has been done in a very eco-friendly, green way to really preserve the nature, and because they want nature to be a huge part of the tourism experience at Neom. So there'll be some of the best diving sites in the world, some of the best nature reserves in the world. I mean, so when the gates are open, all this is done, I mean, tourists will get access to some incredible sites of nature, including dolphins.
And you've already chosen your unit.
I have. I'm asking Arabiya to move me out there. It's an incredible place to live and work.
I might ask the same question. We can live side by side. Thank you so much, Jennifer Bell from Al Arabiya, English journalist. We really appreciate you. Thank you. Now, a reminder of our top stories. Hamas named the 6 Israeli hostages set for release in the final handover of the ceasefire's first phase, with negotiations for phase 2 due to start in the coming days. The family of Shiri Bibas say they cannot mourn her until her body is returned after Hamas released the remains of an unidentified woman at yesterday's handover. Mike Waltz tells CPAC Zelensky will sign the rare earth deal with the US in exchange for military support. And Germany heads to the polls this weekend as Friedrich Merz emerges as a favourite to take over as Chancellor. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you so much for joining us. Riz Khan is coming up next, followed by Hadley Gamble. And of course, don't miss Tom Burgess Watson with G&T. Good night and happy Friday.